All right. Hello, everybody. It is awesome to be here with you. And before we get started, if you could go ahead and in the chat put in where you guys are from, say hello. And today we have a very special topic where we are going to be focusing on fast acting ways to get faster on guitar and more importantly, without practicing more than you do right now. So, this is something that I love to talk about, but I have a special guest that is an expert on this. Runs a amazing website called Practice Guitar Now, where he trains people on how to do this all the time. So today I've got my good friend Mike Filipov to help us out with this. Hey, Mike.
Hey, Dylan. Hello,
Hey, how you
everybody.
doing, man?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's great to see you.
Great to be here.
Awesome, awesome. So one of the first things that I feel like when it comes to practicing guitar is everyone teaches certain licks, they teach fast arpeggio lines, scales, they teach everything, but I feel like when it comes to learning how to actually practice, this isn't taught that much. Do you have any thoughts on just first off why that is? Why is practicing guitar not really trained on?
Yes, I do have a lot of thoughts, and the main one is when there people who are good at guitar, people who are good at anything, oftentimes fall prey to this phenomenon known as the curse of knowledge. Curse of knowledge, and basically what that means is when you're an expert at something, it's hard to remember what it's like to not be an expert at that thing. And so we forget a lot of the struggles and the even just the details that you paid attention to when you were a beginner at something that now you no longer pay attention to because you take it for granted. It's easy for you. And you tend to think, when I say you, I mean great people who are great at something, we tend to forget that newbies have to go through that struggling process too. So they've actually done studies on this. To give you like a concrete example of this, actually relates to ear training, funnily enough. They put two people across from each other, and one of them was asked to just tap the rhythm of a famous melody. And just the rhythm, no pitches. So imagine you're hearing Happy Birthday in your head, the melody, and you just tap the rhythm of it with your hand. And the other person had to guess what the rhythm is. And in like 80 to 90% of the time, they couldn't guess it, even though the person was tapping out like the most obvious and the most simplistic melodies. And so that's an example of curse of knowledge in action. And when it comes to practicing, that's one of the reasons why it doesn't get talked about that much. And the related point to that is whenever somebody does talk about practicing, they typically talk about things that worked for them. So if I am if John Petrucci or whoever talks about practicing, he may be talking about the thing that he's practicing right now and the thing that is working for him in this moment for where he's at. But it's not necessarily going to translate into helping somebody who is nowhere near Petrucci's level to get to Petrucci's level. So that's another common related point to why it's not something people talk about very often. And last but not least, I mean, we can just call a spade here. Practicing isn't as exciting of a topic as, here's an awesome harmonic minor lick or a cool diminished arpeggio sequence that you can practice, which immediately lights your brain up and makes you want to learn it. So if you're making, videos online for the algorithm, you want to get a lot of views, it's not by itself necessarily going to be the most exciting of a topic. So I think those things in combination make practicing, as important as it is, not talked about as much. I'm actually curious, since we're talking about important things not getting as much attention, how do you feel that applies to your niche of ear training? And do you find that many people overlook or not teach ear training as much?
Yeah, it's this. It's with any category of guitar playing. It's the same for ear training. Is no one really discusses how the best way of practicing ear training is. With ear training specifically, it's mainly just taught in one way. It's a very linear way. You just listen to intervals over and over and over until eventually you get it. Or just like what you said, people talk about what worked for them. And what works for a lot of people is a lot of guitarists who've been playing for decades that have a good ear never actually practiced ear training. They just over decades developed an ear, which works. but it takes decades. So it doesn't have to take decades. So it's the same thing as people just talk about what worked for them, or they just don't really go into it. And another thing too that you said is practicing based off what feels the best, like with the flaming arpeggio licks or whatever. You always tend to choose what is going to make you feel the best as opposed to what is actually going to be the best for you. So all of this really crosses over with ear training, with acoustic playing, with shredding, so yeah, it's all the same. And with practicing, a lot of the times when people decide that they want to get better at guitar, their first moment is, I need to practice more. I need to add more time. Do you find that it's more valuable to add more practice time, or first to just make sure that the practice time you're doing is as efficient as possible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do hear this a lot. In fact, most of my students that come to me, they say my number one problem is I don't have enough time to practice. I'm a doctor, or I'm run a business or whatever, so I only have 30 minutes to practice. How do I get more time? Well, that's actually, luckily enough, it's actually not the problem for most people. And the analogy that I give that I think is more useful to think of practicing is, instead of thinking of it in terms of time, like I have to sink in that much time, this many hours, it's better to think of it in terms of repetitions. So let's say you're learning, some arpeggio thing, you're trying to speed that up. What's going to make you play it faster and cleaner is not spending on it 3 hours versus 1 hour. It's rather doing focused repetitions that are designed to refine some aspect of your playing that's preventing you from playing it faster, whether it's tension in your picking hand, or string noise, or the notes not being in time, whatever the case is. You're only going to get better if you know what the problem is you're trying to fix, and the repetitions you're making are allowing you to refine that problem area. And until those things are in place, you can practice it 1,000 hours or 10,000 hours. That stupid saying people talk about, 10,000 hour rule. I disagree with that at all. I mean, I don't believe in that at all. You're not going to get very far. So another analogy that helps to put this whole idea of practicing time into its proper context is, I like to think of repetitions that you do as buckets filled with water that you're using to put out a fire, and the fire being all the things in your playing that are not the way you want them to be. And so every bucket of water that you dump on the fire is like doing one hopefully proper repetition to make your playing a little bit better. And the amount of time you sink into something, that's like bringing in a bunch of buckets, but unless they're filled with water, you're not gonna get very far. So to answer the question in a concise way, obviously it's all about how you practice rather than how much you practice. And once the quality of your practice is in place, then and only then does the amount of time you put into something actually begin to matter. And some of the ways that you can make practicing more effective, I find, I mean, there's a lot of ways, and obviously my whole website and YouTube channel and my courses are all about that, but I'll give kind of three big ones that are likely to make a big difference for anybody listening right now. One is to simply put pauses in between the repetitions. So when you play an exercise one time, instead of just immediately playing it again and then immediately playing it again after that, play it once and then pause for like a good 3, 5, maybe even 10 seconds, and then play back in your mind what you just heard. Meaning, if you play the arpeggio, you pause and you ask yourself, okay, were all the notes clean? Could I even hear all the notes, or were they too fast for me to even pay attention to? How relaxed was my body as I was playing it? Was there string noise? Were the notes in time? Was I even using a metronome? Ask yourself those analysis questions, and then based upon your answers, try to focus on your next repetition to refine your playing compared to the first one. So if in the pause after the first repetition you notice that you were a little bit tense in your right shoulder, for example, in the next repetition, try to be more relaxed in your right shoulder. If the notes were not in time, try to make them more in time. That sort of refinement process is going to go a long way towards making you better faster. And that is that whole proper repetitions focused mindset rather than amount of time focused mindset. So pauses between repetitions is really important. The other thing is setting micro goals for each practice session. So many people, when they think of goals, they think, okay, I have this 30-day goal or this 3-month goal or a year-long goal that I want to, get 50 BPM faster in 6 months or whatever. First of all, that's not something you control because you have no idea how long it's supposed to take you to get 50 BPM faster or whatever. So setting a goal based on an outcome you have no control over is most likely going to lead one of two outcomes. One is you're going to fail to hit the target that you're aiming for, and you're going to feel bad. You're going to feel like you failed, which is not true. Or you may set a goal that's too low and you'll hit it, but you end up not putting in your best effort and kind of coasting your way through the goal. And you could have gotten a lot further, but because you set this goal that turned out to be a limiter on yourself, you didn't get as far as you could have gotten that time. So I don't believe in these strict outcome based goals with deadlines. But micro goals, on the other hand, are things you can control, and these are things you set for a single practice session. So for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to practice this scale sequence, and all I'm going to focus on is keeping my pick closer to the strings, as an example. That is a process that you 100% control, because for each repetition of your scale sequence, you can tell, did you keep the pick as close as you could to the strings, or did you let it move too far outside of the strings? So now the motions are inefficient and sloppy and so on. And by the end of your 20-minute practice session, you've either hit that goal or you didn't, or you slacked off and you focused on something else. So if you stack enough micro goals on top of each other every day, over time, you can't help but get faster and cleaner, or just get better at anything. And I'm sure with ear training, it's kind of the same thing. Micro goals is really, really a big thing when it comes to just making a lot of gains. And the last thing, and that also applies to pretty much anything, whether we're talking about technique, music theory, ear training, songwriting, whatever it is to get feedback on your efforts to do the thing. So in terms of practicing, this is a little bit different than getting feedback on how well you play something, because when you're playing something, it's just a snapshot in time. Okay, you played this solo right now. How good was it? How good did it sound? How clean was it? And so on. But how did you practice to get to that point? The process that you took, what do you do when nobody is looking and you're sitting there refining the solo in this case? That process is something you want to get feedback on. And incidentally, that's pretty much what I work on with my students, giving them feedback on that process, because that is what's going to improve that snapshot in time when it comes time for you to perform the solo. So those are the three things: pauses between repetitions, setting micro goals, and getting feedback on your practicing are going to allow pretty much anybody to get better faster in whatever goal we're talking about. Do you find that to be the case with ear training, Dylan?
Yeah, it's so relevant to ear training. It's the exact same thing. One of the biggest things with ear training with anything is when you're practicing and something isn't right, like you said, just asking the question why will help you out so much. Because that most people don't do that. It's not right, so they just try again and they keep trying again. But if you can identify what the problem is and what actually is happening, then you can focus on it and fix it much, much faster. I think that's why a lot of people progress very slowly in guitar and ear training. Like with ear training, if you're trying to identify a chord progression and you get it wrong, asking yourself why is a great question. Like one of the common problems I had was when I was first training my ear, I couldn't hear the difference between the 4 chord and the 5 chord. They were so similar, but I never asked the question, well, why can't I identify the 4? And it's because I was confusing it with the 5. So when I figured out why, I was able to focus in on those areas and get them much, much better. And another big problem that you said too is with the micro goals. People are very good, we all are very good at setting a really big goal. Like with ear training specifically, people say, I want to be able to transcribe songs by ear immediately, which is great, right? But they only let that massive goal sit there and they don't break it down into much smaller goals. So you constantly feel like you're failing until you get there. You know, if you set all these micro goals, especially every single practice session, and you see yourself consistently hitting them, the odds of you getting there is going to be so much greater because you're so much more encouraged. You have way more fun because you see the progress. You know, so yeah, I think that's extremely true. You know, I want to be able to transcribe songs perfectly, and if I can't, I'm failing. You know, it doesn't go as well. And one thing that you're talking about a lot too is with practicing and everything is focus. I train my students on this a lot because sometimes I hear things like people are practicing in front of the TV, or you know, they've got all these other distractions going on. How important is being focused and focusing in on practicing? How important is that?
Yeah, so focus is obviously really, really important. But the interesting thing about it is the goal that you have with focus is to not focus over time. So here's what I mean.
Yes. Yeah.
When you are all the things that we, and I'm sure you talk about that with your students also, all the little microscopic details of training your ear or training your picking mechanics, whatever the case is, at first you pay attention to them like crazy so that you understand what is going on and you conceptualize it, you can wrap your brain around it. But then the goal is to get it so well ingrained in your muscle memory that you stop focusing on that stuff and you just focus on the higher level thinking of being creative or whatever the case is. So when you're practicing, you have to be focused. Practicing has to be challenging and it has to be mentally effortful, because if it's not, then what are you even doing? Like you're not training anything that's going to make you better. But again, the goal of practicing is to make whatever you're working on feel easier and more automatic, so that you can then move on and not focus on it. Because I mean, when you're playing a solo, you're improvising. Last thing you want to be thinking about, is, are you angling the pick the right way to be more efficient with your playing? That's obviously not what you want to do. But for practicing, it goes back to the idea of micro goals, and with focusing, that's why it's important to have a specific thing you are going to focus on, and then actually focus your brain on it. And but here's something else about focusing. I actually just wrote an email about it the other day. Many people misunderstand the idea of focusing, even the ones who think, okay, I have to be really disciplined and focus on this thing for, hours at a time. That's actually not how our brain works, funnily enough, because as I'm sure everybody will relate to this the moment I say this, it's really, really freaking hard to focus on any one thing for long periods of time. And that goes back to really how our brain is hardwired to process information, going back to like our caveman days. We're not designed with single-minded focus in our brain and mind, because if that's how you try to operate, then some danger, saber-toothed tiger would creep up behind you and eat you. So we have to be paying attention to like a lot of other things at the same time, and not just take information from a single source. That, and when you combine that with social media making people more and more scatterbrained, that just makes the problem worse. But anyway, so how you tie this in with focus is you want to create different variations on what you're practicing. So even as simple as repeating a scale sequence in different keys, for example, is going to give your brain a little different stimulus that is going to allow you to still focus on, let's say, the picking motions or whatever the case is, but in a different context, which allows you to practice longer and focus, quote unquote, on a single thing without getting so bored of it that you eventually slip back into mindless practicing again. And actually, it's probably the easiest thing in the world to tie in with ear training, I imagine. When you find, Dylan, that when you're having your students practice an ear training exercise, that they get bored of it? And so basically, how do you combat this? How do you combat boredom with ear training?
Yes, and this is a huge misconception and problem people have in ear training specifically. I think that with the topic of ear training, people find that to be more boring. And this all comes from just practicing it wrong. So the way that I do it, and this is the way that how I do everything, is that, like you were saying, is you want to, whatever you're practicing, have different variations of what you're practicing, or change up what you're practicing often. So one of my favorite ways to practice is time training. So you'll choose 3 to 5 exercises to go through, and specifically for ear training, maybe it's singing scales, maybe it's listening to emotions or singing arpeggios or whatever it is. And you set a timer on your phone. Every single time the timer goes off, you go on to the next exercise or you go on to the next variation of it. And that way, you're constantly re-engaging your focus, and this fights from being bored. So boredom comes from doing things too often. And one other thing that I've liked to do is I like to measure or time how long can I practice an item before I get bored or before I see my focus starting to go down. So some items it's 5 minutes, some it's 10, some it's 45 seconds, and it's good to take that note so that next time you practice it, you know that this is how much time on average I can focus on it. So that way you can flip it. And I go crazy in detail with that. I'm like obsessed with making it perfect. But another great thing to do is just have things that you're going to practice, but as soon as you get tired or lose focus or bored, just go on to the next thing when you get that feeling. Have you practiced that way before, Mike? Have you found that effective?
Yes, in fact, that's how I practiced kind of intuitively, exactly as you're describing. And I used to not want to talk about it because I thought that I was, the weird one, that
Yeah.
I was supposed to focus on one thing for a long period of time. But then the more I started teaching, and I realized a lot of people are actually like that. And then I started studying like how our brain works, and I'm like, that's actually very consistent with how I was practicing. So maybe that is what you're supposed to do, and more people just aren't talking about it. And so that's one of the things that I hit on with my students is you don't necessarily need to practice one thing for an hour, or if you are going to practice focusing on a single, let's say, area of technique for an hour, you can still do that, but have, like we were talking about, different examples, contextual variations, I call them, context expanding variations is my term for this, where you're focusing on the same thing, but in a new way where it feels new for your brain every time, but it is actually the same thing. They have the same thing in cinematography and storytelling. They call it same but different. Basically, that's what we're talking about. So yeah, we're 100% on the same page here.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just, I mean, if let's say that you're just starting out in guitar and you're just working through chords, like open chords, well, you could just throw a capo on a different fret with the same chords, and that will make it feel new. It's the same thing.
Yep.
Or with singing scales, you could sing scales. This is going back to ear training. You can just change the key, or maybe instead of just doing ascending, now you just do descending. So it's the same thing, just in a slightly different way. It's like tricking your brain. It feels completely new, even though it's pretty much just the same thing over and over. And with practicing, let's go back to practicing speed or practicing stuff on guitar, and this also relates to ear training as far as being able to recall things quickly, is what are some things or some mistakes that you see guitar players make when they're trying to improve their speed?
Oh boy, there's a lot of those.
Yeah, yeah, your top 3 or 5.
Yeah, yeah. I'll give you one. Probably the biggest one is trying to boil speed down to one thing, and that happens very often. If you go to some forum or on a Reddit thread or whatever, and you ask people, "Hey, how do I get faster?" You're almost always going to get somebody giving you one piece of advice in like a Twitter-sized comment. You got to practice slow and gradually build speed a few BPM at a time. Or, the Sean Lane way, you got to push yourself and start with speed, or whatever that trendy, stupid saying is, and clean it up later. People say that too. And the problem is with that is speed is not one thing. It's more like a jigsaw puzzle with a whole bunch of pieces. And giving advice about one thing is like focusing on one corner of the jigsaw puzzle with 10 out of 1,000 pieces. And the additional problem with that is that it might sometimes work. So if you've never practiced slow before, and if all you've ever done is just try to push yourself and try to play as fast as possible and move your hands faster, somebody tells you, hey, slow down and clean it up. Yeah, it's going to work at first because you've never done this before. So the problem is that type of practicing fixes, you're going to, at least to some extent, refine as well. But then you're going to hit a plateau for all kinds of reasons. Like, for example, if you practice slowly, But with motions that are inefficient, that are going to be inefficient at faster playing, then it's only going to work up to a certain tempo, because the motions you're using at slow speeds are just not effective. But if you didn't know that, you didn't fix that part of the jigsaw puzzle, then it's only going to take you as far as it's going to take you, but then you're going to get stuck. So boiling speed down to one thing is huge. Partially going back to the curse of knowledge thing, many people only tell you what worked for them, but or the most obvious thing, or the most logical thing that they think that they're supposed to say. It's like, just take the slow practice, for example. Somebody tells you, how do you get faster? Well, you start slow and then you get faster. It sounds like the most logical thing in the world, like it can't possibly be wrong. But there's a lot of context that's missing from that. And so the next point is actually something related to what I was just talking about. Too much slow practice, because it is so obvious and so intuitive that you have to practice slowly. The first time somebody says, okay, I'm going to work on speed, so I'm going to start slow and try to make things perfect. We talked about one of the mistakes, which is using inefficient motions that you can only get away with up to a certain tempo, but then past a certain tempo, they're not effective anymore. And the other thing is with that, you tend to make mistakes. Certain mistakes you tend to run into will only happen near your top speeds. So at slow speeds, it feels so perfect that you trick yourself into thinking that your playing is actually cleaner than it is, and because you don't hear the mistakes that will only happen later on. And so because of that, you don't get to fix them. And as a related point to that, if you only have, let's say, 30 minutes to practice something, and you start at 50% of your speed and you try to get to 100% of your speed, most of your time is being spent in the range of speeds that are too easy and not challenging enough. And so by the time you get to the faster stuff where it gets challenging, A, you're already mentally drained because you've spent your mental energy, and B, you are running out of time. You have to move on and practice something else. But to flip all this on its head, many people also practice way too fast. And that actually relates to ear training also, because many people, I find, they just don't hear their mistakes. Mainly because they're focused too much on what their hands are doing and they're not really listening at all, or they're practicing past the tempo threshold where they can hear the mistakes. So that goes back to my previous point of thinking of speed as one thing when it's not. You have to know when it is appropriate to slow something down and how far to slow down, because to make things even more confusing, you can practice too slowly at a tempo where you have absolutely nothing to focus on. And you have to know also when to push yourself. And the other thing we talked about with not listening to the quality of each repetition, and to combat this, I'm going to refer back to my earlier point of putting a pause between repetitions. You play something, you pause, and you ask yourself, okay, how did this sound and how can I make it better? And if you can't answer the question, that is your clue that you're going too fast, or you don't know even what to focus on. And the solution to that is to simply have somebody good. When I say good, I don't mean necessarily a good player. I mean somebody with a good ear for spotting flaws. Listen to you play and point out, hey, here are the things you're doing wrong. Here's what you can be doing better. Focus on those next time and find the fastest speed where you can still process the notes that you're playing and judge their quality in real time. I'm sure you have a lot of similar issues like that relating to ear training, where people are trying to sing an exercise and they're making all kinds of mistakes. Their notes are not in tune or whatever the case is, and they're not hearing it. So how do you correct that in your students?
Yes, and speed is something that's not talked a lot about in ear training. It's just not really a huge topic, which I think is a mistake, because you want to be able to transcribe things very quickly. And really the things that I tell my students is exactly what you just said, is slowing things down. If you're hearing things, you don't even know why you're messing it up or you can't transcribe it, slowing it down is a really good thing. right? But I think it completely depends on the person because, like you just said, you can make a mistake of going too fast, you can make a mistake of going too slow, and you're kind of giving advice for everybody. And what I found in my students is you need to be good at diagnosing your own problems and figuring out what is going on specifically for you. There's a lot of different ways of improving speed, of improving your ear training speed and all of these different things, but there's not specifically just one exercise or one really good way that is going to fix everything. And it's something that I learned from you, Mike, is that you want to treat it like a toolkit. You want to start collecting a lot of different ways to fix specific problems in your playing and your speed and your ear training so that you can pull out that tool to fix the specific problem you're having at that moment. So when you're talking about you need to practice faster, that is one tool that you can have. Practicing slower is one tool, and you kind of need to become your own doctor and diagnose your own, musical sicknesses, musical problems, and then figure it out. And in the beginning, this can be tough to figure out because you don't know what it is. The first step is figuring out what the problem is, and then just make your best guess at how to fix it, and then just see how that happens. And one other mistake, and I'm curious about your opinion on this, Mike, with speed, I see a lot of the times is when people are trying to increase their speed, they don't track their progress, whether it's they're not taking videos of how they're playing or they're not tracking the BPM. I find the same thing in ear training. What percentage of the time can you accurately transcribe this at this BPM? Do you find people not tracking their progress to harm their ability to increase speed? Is it not that big of a deal? What do you think?
Uh, I think you do need to track your progress, but you need to do it in a intelligent way and a purposeful way. So here's what I mean by that. Simply writing down BPMs at which you can play something is okay. What I find many people don't do enough of is watching their hands into a mirror or into a webcam. And when you're filming yourself, look for specific things. So if you're just filming yourself just to film yourself, that's fine. But you need to know, okay, I'm filming myself, but the goal here of this video is to focus on not moving the pick with the index finger and the thumb and pick more from my wrist, as an example. And so you're going to, first of all, film at a proper angle where you can see that problem happening or not happening. And you're going to you're going to practice at tempos where it's just fast enough to control the problem, but meaning it's going to be slow enough for you to control the problem, but it's fast enough to also require your full concentration so that you're not practicing too slowly and then it's too easy and you're not really training anything. So you got to practice right on the edge of your ability to do the thing. And so if you are going to track your progress, make sure that you are comparing apples to apples and you are practicing always at the threshold of control, as I like to call it, where it's the tempo is slow enough for you to do the thing you're trying to do, but fast enough to be challenging. And that threshold has to trend up over time rather than, okay, I practiced. I always start at, 40 BPM and go to 50, then go to 55, then go to 60. That is kind of mindless tracking that some people do. So it goes back to the idea of micro goals. You want to have those really, really clearly defined for yourself and then track things in the context of micro goals. But otherwise, yeah, of course, tracking your progress is going to make a big difference.
Do you find it really helpful to track the progress of specific techniques? Like let's just go back to the BPM example to make it simple. Is a lot of the times people are tracking how fast they can play everything or a specific lick at a certain BPM. Do you find it helpful to see, well, how fast can I play it with just right hand, keeping the pick perfectly? How fast can I play it with just left hand? Do you find that categorizing these things can be helpful?
Not to that level not to that extent. I do find playing it with just the right hand or just with the fretting hand is really, really important for the sake of clarity, so that you know what the motions are and you can do them without having to think about it. Going back to what we talked about earlier, focusing only in the beginning to make sure you're doing things the right way every time. But I don't think it's really that important to play the picking hand motions of a lick at the same at your goal speed. As long as you can play it at 60, 70%, that's fine, because now you know the motions well enough that you can bring in the fretting hand and focus on the other challenges of like synchronization and so on. But to address your main question, Dylan, tracking, when it comes to speed, for example, I like to have maybe 2 or 3 examples of things that I track. So like the thing that I find the easiest to play fast, and that's like my top speed, right? So let's say for me, sweep picking is probably the easiest thing to play fast by far. So if somebody asks me, hey, what's your top speed? I'm probably going to quote like my sweep picking speed. And so I track that to know that my top end speed, or as I call it in my courses, your gun to the head top speed. If somebody puts a gun to your head, how fast can you play? That is, I have an example of that. Then I have more of like a daily driver kind of a speed with like scale sequences. So I have a scale sequence that's a good example of the types of things I normally play in my music, and I track speed with that. And then beyond that, it has to be context specific. So if you're practicing a set of licks for a solo that you're going to be performing, then obviously you track your progress with and your speed with those. And this way it becomes way less overwhelming when you only have 2 or 3 main signposts, if you will, that you're tracking progress with at any given time. And of course, they will evolve as your goals and priorities evolve. But this way, it minimizes overwhelm, and it also gives you the benefit of tracking your progress, which makes things, gives you the best of both worlds.
Yeah, great. Awesome. And then the next question is, how can people improve their speed? What are some great ways of practicing that you really like to do that can help improve speed without having to practice for hours and hours?
Sure. So one of them I like a lot is actually going to be counterintuitive, because we're talking about speed, is to play something at, let's say, 50% of the goal tempo, which I know is counterintuitive, but make it sound absolutely flawless. And when I say flawless, I mean you should be able to listen to it and tell yourself, okay, the only thing missing from this is speed. Otherwise, the articulation is spot on. The synchronization is super tight. I'm feeling very, very relaxed when I play this. The tone of the notes is really good. And basically, if I put this on a record right now, it would still sound freaking awesome. And the only thing that's missing from here is just getting it faster. Otherwise, I'm absolutely, totally happy with everything. And it sounds like a very, very simple thing to do. But if you were to try it with any solo you're trying to speed up, you will realize a lot of things that are missing from your awareness of being able to play something right now. Like, how well do you really know the motions? When you try to play something at 50% of the speed, you'll notice your brain freezing up between notes. You're not going to even know, okay, is the next note, is it downstroke or is it an upstroke? Am I supposed to move the pick outside the space of the strings to get to the next note, or do I keep the pick right next to the string? You're going to realize that a lot of the things you were doing when you're trying to play at 80 to 90%, you were going just by pure instinct. You don't really know what each hand is supposed to do. So getting that clarity at 50%, 50% is, of course, just an arbitrary example. It doesn't have to be exactly 50%, is going to expose a lot of flaws that once you fill in those gaps in your understanding and the awareness of what is even happening in this lick, is going to allow you to automatically play it faster just by getting that clear on something and focusing on perfection of every single note. I find that many people don't do that nearly enough. They just try to push themselves to move their hands faster and they get stuck. So that's one. That's a really simple thing anybody can do no matter what your skill level is. And in fact, before we move on to the next one, where I kind of learned that from is I've seen clips of John Petrucci warming up backstage at shows, and he was playing solos from his songs at probably, I would guess, around half speed. And one thing that stuck out to me is just how awesome every single note sounded. It was complete perfection. The timing, the tone, the articulation, everything was. He added all the phrasing ornaments. The vibrato was still in time with the click, even at half speed, which I'm pretty sure is a big part of what made it easier for him to play it at full speed, that night also. So that's the first thing. Another thing, when you are doing what I talked about earlier with putting pauses between repetitions, one question you can ask yourself is, how can you make things feel easier. And then you just think about 1, 2, or 3 ways to make what you just played feel easier. You will probably, if you ask that question, notice that you are more tense in your body than you should be. And tension, in case anybody doesn't know, is a big killer of speed. So if you notice tension, if you can relax it, you're gonna and you then keep that tension from flaring back up. You're going to be able to play things faster because you're using less effort to do it. So just asking yourself that question in between the repetitions is going to help you a lot. And another thing I'll say that also relates to kind of ear training, but from a different perspective, is to train your ear for faster playing. So, one exercise that you can do that's really simple is you can take a lick or scale sequence or whatever you're trying to speed up, and you enter it into, say, Guitar Pro or some program that can play it back for you at a billion notes a minute if you set it, the tempo fast enough, and then listen to it in headphones and see just how well you can follow the notes in real time when they're being played that fast, but it's the computer playing them back. And most people, I find, really struggle with this. You will find the notes are going by so fast that your brain is not able to keep up with everything. And so you can have little practice sessions of a couple of minutes at a time where all you do is find the top speed of you being able to even hear the notes, and then work on boosting that up a little bit. And what that's going to do is it's going to improve your brain's ability to process your actual playing. When you're playing with your guitar and you're playing things at your tempos that are the top speed of what your hands can do, if your brain can simply think faster and hear notes at that speed more clearly, you'll be able to notice your mistakes a whole lot better. Because for many people, their hands are actually moving faster than what their brain can do, than how fast their brain can process the notes, which is a big reason why many people make mistakes without realizing it, and they think their playing sounds okay until somebody points out, hey, you're actually, this note was sloppy and there was some string noise over here and so on. But if your brain gets faster than what your hands can do, then you'll notice your mistakes a lot better, and you'll be able to fix them much more easily as well. So actually, on a related note, Dylan, when you're training your students to improve their ear, do you find what I said to be true about the speed of their ability to process notes in real time? Is that often a limiting factor, or is something else a limiting factor?
No, it's definitely a limiting factor because it all comes down to how quickly your brain can identify what you're hearing. I mean, that's really what ear training is. And being able to hear it at very slow speeds. And then I've done exactly what you said. The whole Guitar Pro trick is to put it in there and then hear it really sped up is an excellent way, or whatever program. But a lot of people struggle with this. Is if let's say, for example, you've got a song at like 65 BPM. A lot of the times people can transcribe that okay, and at least with their guitar in hand they can figure it out. But when you get into 120 or songs at 140 or solos where you have 16th notes going everywhere or triplets going everywhere, that's really difficult. They could transcribe those notes easily if it was half the speed, but the reason that they can't is because they never practice transcribing music that is that fast. And it's the same thing with practicing. You don't realize, if you're playing it really fast, you don't realize your mistakes because your brain isn't keeping up. Well, when it comes to ear training, you're going to not hear notes, or you're going to hear notes incorrectly, or 3 or 4 notes is going to sound as like one note because your brain isn't able to process the information fast enough. And this whole thing about you're talking about is practicing slowly, practicing quickly is great. This is stuff that I do in my practice, my guitar practice, my ear training practice. I love taking an item and then playing it at 100%, and then playing it at 50%, and then playing it at 110 or 120%, and then just keeping that on a rotation or however I see fit with whatever I'm practicing. And one thing I've noticed too is a lot of the times what I think is 100% actually isn't 100%. Now I see this in the students a lot of the times too. If they think they can play here and then they try to play here, well, they find out, well, oh, this is actually the ceiling, because they either have self-limiting beliefs or whatever, but playing up there is good. And another way that I relate it to is that when you practice faster than you're comfortable with, it's the same thing as like if you see, guys playing baseball and they're about to swing. They put all the weights on the bat, right? And they swing and then they take it off and the bat is somehow lighter. This is what happens when you're practicing. Because if you practice at 110, 120%, and then you go back down to the 100%, well, that 100% isn't going to feel nearly as heavy or nearly as difficult. So it all relates really well.
Yes, I actually have a similar analogy with my students just from bench pressing. If you load up 300 pounds on the bar, and let's say that's more than you can bench, and then that feels heavy, and then you take it off, you only have 100 pounds, then 100 pounds are going to fly, like an empty bar. So it's
Yeah,
the same exact analogy.
man. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, something else you said that's really, really useful, I think, for building speed that probably I should have mentioned. Going from, like you said, from 50 to 100 to 110 or whatever it was, you have these big jumps you mentioned in the tempos.
Yes.
I like that a lot because one thing that does, as opposed to going from 50% to 52 to 55, is you get to feel things that change in your playing very, very quickly. So if you play at 50%, it feels okay, good. Then you jump to 80% or 90%, and all of a sudden you feel a whole bunch of crap going wrong. Let's say, okay, you pick 3 of those things. Okay, tension in the shoulder, then the notes are not in time, and then in the middle it was all like a mess. Like those are the 3 big things that kind of catch your attention. You go back to 50%, you pay extra attention to keeping the shoulder relaxed and staying clean throughout the lick. And so this way you're already focusing more on the right types of things. So I think that's a really, really smart way to go about it.
Yeah, and something you said about practicing in front of a mirror or in front of a webcam, I think even recording yourself, because when you practice 50%, watch how you look when you're doing it, and then watch how you look when you go to 100% and then 120%. And you being able to see the differences, like different things, like my shoulder would come up just slightly or my arm would come out. So all these little micro things that happen that you don't even realize happens, So being able, and I find taking videos to be really helpful because practicing in front of a mirror is awesome. But when I take the video, I don't have to focus on looking at anything. I just take the video and then really sit down and analyze it. So I really, and it's also a great way to keep track your progress.
Yeah,
if you think you're not progressing, well, then look at a video you took 6 months ago, and you'll realize that you did,
For sure.
But Mike, this has all been awesome, very useful. Do you have any final advice about practicing or increasing speed or anything?
Just watch this whole talk. I think is just filled with all kinds of tips and advice that I think it's going to take somebody multiple watches through to take notes on and then start applying in your playing. But I think the main thing I'll say is do your best to not feel overwhelmed by so I mentioned like the whole jigsaw puzzle thing about speed versus being one thing. It can feel really, really overwhelming. One thing that can help is to just pick one thing to refine and to improve in your playing that's new to you that you haven't thought about before. So maybe it's the micro goals thing, or putting repetitions, putting breaks between the repetitions, or the whole idea of priming yourself. What I think Alexis put in the chat, potentiation sets. I like that term. To prepare your brain and your mind for the faster tempos, and then making the slower things feel easier in comparison. And just try any of those things, and you'll already likely notice some improvements. And then from there, just make a study out of practicing. And obviously, my website and my YouTube channel got a whole bunch of stuff there that you can look, and so check that out. And so the more you study the thing you want to get good at, the most obvious advice ever, right? The better you're going to get at it. So really, that's really all I have to say about that.
Awesome. And then also you have a resource for these guys that you can look at. Can you tell us a little bit about that for a second?
Yes. So speaking of guitar speed, I have this video masterclass all about building speed without doing any slow practice whatsoever. So I have a special way to practice where you don't have to do any slow practice at all. You don't have to do the whole start at 50% and increase, 2 BPM at a time and so on. It's based upon some of the things we were talking about with Dylan over the past hour. And it doesn't take a lot of practice time either. If you have, 20, 25, 30 minutes to practice, you can use this. And it's pretty simple stuff. And if you use it, you'll likely see some pretty noticeable speed gains, and also gains in just accuracy and cleanliness as early as potentially tomorrow, and it's free. So you can check it out at the link that I think Dylan is going to put up on the screen here in a second, and also maybe in the chat or whatever. Again, it's free. Check it out and enjoy.
Yeah, so I've put that link in the chat for you guys.
Thank you,
Let me
Dylan.
put it over here, and also you can also go to this link right here, practiceguitarnow.com/speed, and download that. And then I also have a resource for you guys as well. I've got a free video on 5 of my easiest and fun ways to practice ear training that looks like this right here. You can go to that link, and I'll also include that link in the chat as well here for you guys. Put this in here. There you go. So you guys can download that, check out Mike's, and both links should be in there now. But Mike, thank you so much for joining me, man. Thank you for giving your wisdom and helping us learn how to improve our speed.
Thanks, Dylan. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Absolutely. And thank all of you guys. I appreciate it. Have a good rest of your day or night, wherever you are. And I'll see you guys next time.
Take care.